Hello and welcome to episode 83 of the Plain Accounts podcast series, where every week we get together and discuss the upcoming gospel election to preach to our congregations this coming week. Today we're joined with Dr. Joe Gorman from Northwest Nazarene University. Dr. Gorman, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast today. Thanks so much for joining us. Would you mind telling our audience a bit about yourself and some of the work and ministry that you're involved in?
Sure. I'm going on my 8th year at NNU. I teach in the area of Christian ministry and practical theology, missions. Before coming to NNU, I was a local church pastor in the same church for 21 years in Golden, Colorado. Golden is just on the west side of Denver. Before that, I was a youth pastor for a couple years in Spokane, right out of college before I went to seminary. While I was in Colorado, I started traveling to Africa about once a year. And so for the last 16 years, my life has been interwoven, with kind of a rhythm of being here in the U.S. and then traveling to Africa about once a year to do various compassionate ministry projects. And so, that perspective really influences the way I read the Gospels and the way I think about what it is to be a Christ follower. And I think of words I read by Richard Stearns, the CEO of World Vision, several years ago, and which is really true of me, that going to Africa has ruined my life for good. And so, that my friends and my experiences in Africa and, certainly as a minister within the Wesleyan holiness tradition, leads me to look at, the needs of this world locally and globally very holistically, that it's not just spiritual or physical, but it's both. That as I mentioned in the lectionary blog, that spiritual and physical needs for Jesus are not two sides of they are two sides of the same coin. That they're not two separate things, or caring for people's physical needs isn't just something we do after we get through saving people's souls. But anyway, that's part of my passion. And another one of my passions, as a pastor, I experienced some dark days and months of depression. And so, I've spent a good deal of my ministry at NNU trying to help pastors be healthier emotionally, lay people to be healthier and happier emotionally. And then I guess just about a week ago, I finished the final major edits for a book that I wrote that'll be coming out sometime between March and May. The title is Healthy, Happy, and Holy 7 Practices for a Flourishing Life. So we talk about, Sabbath and stress management, sleep and exercise, the importance of playing hobbies. What else did I talk about? Oh, and healthier eating, and then help people to put this sort of in a to develop a rule of life. So Africa ministry, holistic health and happiness, those are, kind of my passions.
Wow, that's incredible. Well, I want to talk about all of those things, but it looks like we have to get onto the gospel passage. That's interesting. I'd love to hear more about those components of your ministry later on. Today we're going to focus on Matthew chapter 25, verses 31 through 46. We've been going through these eschatological parables in the lectionary these last week, starting with the parable of the foolish and wise bridesmaids. We had the parable of the talents, or the bags of gold, last Sunday, and we're going to the sheep and the goats this Sunday. So let me read the passage, and we can jump into a little bit more of a conversation on this text. Matthew 25, verses 31 through 46. This will be from the NIV version. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne, will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. And the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go visit you?" The king will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." Then he will say to those on his left, "Depart from me, who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not invite me in. I needed clothes, and you did not clothe me. I was sick and in prison, and you did not look after me." They also will answer, "Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger and needing clothes or sick or in prison and did not help you?" He will truly reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me." Then they will go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life. The written word of the Lord. So it seems a bit to me, passage, at least the temptation is to focus on what it says about the afterlife more so than it does about Jesus' call to compassionate service, helping the least of these. Because I'm going through a Bible study on Book of Revelation in my Wednesday night group at church, and Revelation talks pretty opposite about eternal punishment, like hell, Satan, sin, death. All of those things are destroyed in chapter 19. But here we have Jesus from his lips talking about eternal punishment and how these people will spend eternity being, destroyed in hell. And so, I guess one of the first questions I want to ask is, what should be our primary focus? And maybe what is Jesus trying to get across the most by this parable?
I think that's a really good point, Ben, because I think many times, especially in our evangelical subculture, we tend to spiritualize salvation. That salvation is just getting into heaven. It's saving our personal souls, and as long as we're okay, then we tend to think, well, it's too bad that these other people suffer, but I'm going to go home and be with Jesus, so it'll all be okay in the end. But I think the reason Jesus provides this eschatological apocalyptic backdrop is to engage the Matthean community and us by extension into doing works of righteousness, to be kingdom people here and now. I mean, so Jesus' words are quite the opposite of the way we often misinterpret this passage. And I mentioned Richard Stearns earlier, and if any of the readers haven't read Stearns' book from several years ago, The Hole in Our Gospel, I really can't recommend that strongly enough, because he says, the center, kind of in the evangelical world, there is a hole in our gospel. It's like we have cut out passages like Matthew 25, 31 through 46, and because they're too uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And they're a little too this worldly, and I, not to get too theological, but I think it all goes back to our Christology and understanding how how the incarnation is, how it gives us eyes to see and hands to work, here and now, because Jesus, is fully God, fully human. He fully engaged those who are hurting and then lonely, the least of society. As fully God, fully human, Jesus could have been like some of the Gnostic heresies of the early church, and not been fully human, and could have just been a ghost or a phantasm and not really been affected by people. But he touched lepers. He didn't just see a leper off in the distance, but he actively engaged them. I think of the woman with the bleeding disorder. I mean, she touched his garment. The woman who wet Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair. I mean, just all very physical kinds of things. So the incarnation, that Jesus is incarnated in the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, should kind of prod us, poke us, wake us up to the work that Jesus has for us to do here and now. So this passage shouldn't lead us to speculate, on the future, but to engage the present as the eyes, ears, hands, and feet of Jesus. And you mentioned the book of Revelation. It's very this worldly, and I think essentially the gospel is very this worldly because God created it, God loves it, God sustains it. But again, some people say, well, it's all going to go up in smoke anyway. So why should we care about the widows, the orphans, and the poor? Why should we care about climate change? And something I didn't put in my blog was, I think, somebody, a preacher's really brave. They could also talk about how climate change disproportionately affects the vulnerable. The poor, have less means to protect themselves, less means to respond to, climate crises. They tend to live in areas that are less protected than others. And so this, again, kind of our American evangelical way of looking at salvation is very individualistic. It kind of prevents us from seeing some of these broader social ramifications of the gospel, and certainly not to be critical, but to think of, Jesus talks about illness here. Healthcare should matter to God's people, and certainly we'll have different ideas about how we address that. So there's just lots of different ways one could go in engaging and responding to the rhetorical power of this passage.
That's really good. I love that shift of perspective of having it be this worldly, that rather than trying to speculate or look at what's really to come. Because it's really an obsession in our culture to try to look at and speculate the future rather than see how Christ is calling us to participate with the kingdom here and now. And that's what I pulled from the last two parables, is that his emphasis is, am I gonna return and find you busy? Am I gonna return and find you about the kingdom rather than looking up at the stars waiting for me to arrive? Or am I gonna find you filled with oil? Am I gonna find you ready and invested into the kingdom with the resources I've given you? Yeah, I really like that. I think another temptation, at least for me growing up, was reading this parable and trying to find out who's a sheep and who's a goat. And I think it's a temptation for the church, at least, on saying, okay, where are those, like, who's in and who's out, and how do I make sure that I'm on the in crowd? And I think that shapes a wrongful interpretation of this parable as well.
Yeah, and again, I don't think that should be the focus of our approach to this passage either, because the point is, don't worry about that person or that person. Worry about yourself. What are you doing to respond to the call of Jesus? Because Jesus doesn't say, to the sheep. We'll speculate about who's a goat and who's a sheep. And the sheep were really rather clueless. They're very self-aware. As they went about loving and doing good to the least of these. That they really had no clue that they were serving Jesus. And then certainly the goats were clueless as well. But I find for the sheep, their love and compassion for the least of these was just organic overflow of their lives. It was who they were. And maybe another interesting angle to this passage as well that I don't talk about in the blog is, Jesus doesn't really talk about this parable in terms of necessarily even his followers, but anybody who shows compassion. So within my own Wesleyan holiness tradition, that leads me to look at how prevenient grace, God's salvific will is present throughout the world. That God, yes, has chosen the church to uniquely represent Christ and his kingdom to the world, but God is at work throughout the entire world. So wherever somebody is hungry or thirsty or is a stranger or has inadequate food or shelter or is in prison, people are caring for those people. Then whether they're a Christ follower or not, they are still working to fulfill God's purposes in the world.
Yeah. The Good Samaritan comes to mind, the one who is the outcast, doesn't worship the right way, worships the wrong God as far as everyone's concerned, but Luke calls him by the same Greek word that he calls Christ, as the messenger of the Father's love, like the messenger of God's service, as in his service of the one who's beaten up on the side of the road. That blew my mind when I read that first, because it said to me, just like you said with our Wesleyan holiness tradition, is that God is not bound by the guidelines that we put and the parameters there, but God can use anyone who is humble and obedient to that compassion that God has. That's an incredible perspective.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, so what do we do with Christians who don't feed the hungry or give the thirsty to drink, or who reject the strangers and refugees, who live out of fear rather than love? And then you look at, like going back to the parable of the Good Samaritan, some people have suggested to kind of return to the provocativeness of Jesus' parable, is to say, well, what about renaming that, the parable of the good Muslim in our day, to add that edge, that original edge back to it, that original rhetorical power that parable had within Jesus' context. But yeah, what about the good Muslim who, clothes, the naked, and feeds the hungry and visits those in prison? Yeah, so I mean, those are again, those are some avenues maybe somebody wants to go down as they interact with this parable, or maybe if they use this in a Sunday school class or whatever, you could bring up some of these issues and have some lively discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. That's another area that I think what you mentioned, bravery, would be needed. My mind immediately jumps to why Jesus used sheep and goats rather than Pharisees and Sadducees, like two disparate groups that he's trying to pick, because he's not trying to, cut with a political knife, but he is trying to say the kingdom will be represented this way. And those who follow in this way will then be considered the blessed and participate in God's plan from the beginning. It's this compassionate service. It's not something that you can just claim to be and therefore you are, We have this division in our own culture between, conservative, liberal, Republican, Democrat, and on all those divisions. And we have this sort of assumption that because we're part of this party line, then we are diametrically opposed to all of those other ones on the other side. And I don't think Christ is trying to make those sorts of divisions with the sheep and the goats, but rather showing a way of being in the world. And then those who don't live in that way of being are not part of the kingdom. Would that be an accurate approach, you think?
No, I think that fits in very well. Thinking back to just 3 chapters earlier in Matthew, where the religious leaders confronted Jesus with the coin, and whose image is on the coin, Caesar, and should we serve Caesar or not? And Jesus said, well, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what is God. And I think the point there is ultimately, whose image do we bear? And again, he was trying to transcend, the artificial boundaries, that the religious leaders had created. And I think that's one of the other reasons, as you were pointing out, why this passage is so important for us today, is because it seems like we get so stuck in our echo chambers, that we just hear the same things over and over and over again. And, we really need to read our Bibles more, than, get caught up in the latest, news frenzy. And certainly I stay engaged with the news too, but, I'm just really rather brokenhearted and disappointed by many of the Christians that I hear about and read about these days. And it's like, read your Old Testament, read the major and minor prophets.
Yeah.
And if you can't do that, at least read the Gospels.
Yeah.
Because what you're seeing is so anti-Christ. Again, kind of going back to what you're talking about, the book of Revelation. And it's whose image do we bear in the world? Do we bear that of Christ or that of the beast? And if we bear the image of Christ, then we're going to feed the hungry and clothe the naked. We're going to visit those in prison, take care of them, and welcome the refugees, and care for those who are sick. I mean, that's just for those who are in an organic, overflowing relationship with Christ. Those sorts of attitudes and actions will just flow out of it. So it doesn't mean that it's easy. It's quite often very painful. But I think especially for those of us who are preaching and teaching these days, the call for us is always to be prophetic, but especially in these days, we need to speak a prophetic word, in love, and but also in truth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's powerful. Well, I loved your discussion about using the good Muslim in the Good Samaritan. Moving to how we might preach this to our congregations this Sunday, what sort of maybe word pictures or contemporary pictures could we possibly use to help bring that edge to this parable for our congregations, and then invite them to really reflect and understand what Christ is trying to convey here?
Well, let me start talking with some of the ideas I presented at the end of my post, just some practical ways to think of this passage. Because to me, when I was a pastor of a local church, and whenever I sit and listen to a sermon, I always want to know, okay, how do I respond to this?
Right.
Give me some ideas, and how I could practically engage this text in my world. And so where this passage comes is very interesting, being right on the cusp. We're landing, out ordinary time, and we're getting ready to take off into Advent, but especially to think of the life situation of our listeners, that they'll be coming out of Thanksgiving week, many of them experiencing the turkey coma, as they show up on Sunday mornings, which is unfortunate. But also thinking about our culture's orientation during Advent, that our culture's orientation is anything but that of, the hungry, the thirsty, the lonely, the imprisoned, the sick, the naked. It's about buying presents. And I mentioned in my post, that in America we spend over $600 billion a year, maybe this year, well over $700 billion a year on Christmas presents. And that, some are nice, some are needed things, but many of them are not. And again, it's not to destroy anybody's Christmas celebrations. My family and I, we exchange gifts, but for a long time we've tried to balance what we give each other with what we give to others. Just beyond what we do give for our local church. And my trips to Africa have greatly influenced that. So, I give the example of, perhaps you and your family could think about, how can we give gifts with a purpose this, Christmas season? Instead of just buying somebody something that they don't already need, how can we invest in the kingdom? How can we help care for one of the least of these? So I suggest, maybe you want to sponsor a child, maybe you want to go together as a church or a small group, raise money for digging a well someplace in a developing country to provide somebody with clean water. Maybe you want to sponsor a family in your local community who is struggling. So we can, it's not just giving money globally, but it's also doing things we can locally as well. And part of my ministry in Africa several years ago, I started a nonprofit organization, Compassion for Africa. So we do education for girls, through a pair of pigs, kind of like the Heifer Project. And so, people might want to consider Heifer Project, as one of their ministries. There's certainly Compassion for Africa as well. Yeah. And you can check us out on Facebook. But we have a lot of local churches who partner with us in that. But certainly, there's more long-term responses to this passage as well, and thinking about helping people with their short and long-term food needs. There's many churches who are starting community gardens, to help people in their local congregations eat more healthily, and then maybe to help local food banks, supply them with fresh fruits and vegetables. There's just lots of different things that we could do to make this specific and concrete.
That I like that a lot. Yeah, giving them those tangible ways to answer this parable with some practical methods of serving the least in our culture. I think a big part of it is that they just don't know who those are. Like, our faith has become, and our lives just overall have become so private and individualized that we get ourselves into a groove and a cycle, and we don't encounter the poor. We don't encounter the least among us. And so maybe a good part of this is just illuminating who they are in our local context, in our global context, and say, we can't just live lives disconnected from these people, but our lives really do impact each other. And will we live in a way of being that impacts them for the kingdom, or that ignores them and abandons them to their brokenness? And understanding that in a real way, because I only think it's recently in my own life, my own journey, that what my actions towards or neglect of the least of these directly impacts Christ, directly impacts my relationship with Jesus. And when I read this, it's so convicting to me, because if I really truly believe that whatever I do or don't do to the least of these is done to Jesus, then
Right.
I can't have a faith that doesn't include loving and serving the poor.
Yeah, exactly. And there was a quote I didn't quite have room in here, but again, from my own tradition within the Church of the Nazarene, Phineas Brzee, one of the founders of the Church of the Nazarene, he says, we can get along without rich people, but we cannot get along without preaching the gospel to the poor, which again, it turns on its head, the focus of so many churches in our day, including our own denomination.
Yeah.
A very sad, commentary, and that really challenges me. And I would prefer to ignore those kinds of things. But, history and the gospel and Jesus don't allow me to do that.
Mm-hmm. No. Wow. Well, this has been so helpful. I tell Danny quite often that I think it's pretty selfish that we do these podcasts, because I feel like I benefit the most from these conversations for my sermons coming up. So this has just been really helpful for me, and I know it is for those who listen in. Are there any other closing comments or thoughts that you think we might need to think about that we didn't cover in our conversation?
No, I mean, we could go on and
Sure.
talk more, but if anyone wants to engage me further, ask further questions, they can contact me on Facebook, and they can find me there easily. And I'm glad to continue the conversation. And I love this passage, but yet it's a painful one, and I realize how far short of it that I fall, and so it's not to say that any of us are perfect at this. And I know one thing I mentioned in the blog post too is sometimes we can feel overwhelmed of a passage like this or human need, and then we can think, well, since I can't do everything, I won't do anything. But each of us do something. I think in my local church in Golden, Colorado, we were a small church, but we started small and started raising some money for some of the projects we did in Africa, and we also did a lot of local community things too. But we raised money for goats, ducks, and chickens and pigs, and we're able to build some schools and churches, and provide for orphans in Central and West Africa, and if we as a small church can do that, and we paid all of our world evangelism budgets and all that stuff, that again, everybody can do something. We just need to discern together as pastor and churches what that something is, and what we're truly passionate about. And that's not something I can tell anyone exactly what that looks like. Right. So each pastor and church will need to prayerfully discern that together.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's so helpful. Yeah, and if anyone is wanting to continue the conversation, there's always a comment feature at the end of every commentary on a Plain Account. So if you'd like to continue this conversation, please comment below Dr. Gorman's commentary or any of the other commentaries we have on the website, and follow us on all those social media outlets, and sign up for our newsletter to stay connected. And we're looking forward to some new developments with the website to make it more helpful for resourcing preachers in the time to come. Dr. Gorman, this was so helpful. Thank you so much for joining us today.
All right. Well, you're welcome, Ben, and thank you and Danny for what you do. You provide an awesome resource for pastors and local churches, and so thank you for all you do.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you so much. All right, well, go in peace and preach boldly. this week.
You too, friend.